So welcome back. Today it's our second encounter with Harrison Campbell. So Harrison is talking to us directly from Calgary, and he's a PhD candidate. I'm the student, he's the candidate. And his research is on literacy education through theater. And the methodology he uses is posthumanism, and that's what we're going to talk about. Although it's a very specific type of posthumanism, and then we will talk about it during this interview or conversation, more like it, how diverse and open it is, this methodology and theory for the research. Hello, Harrison.
Hello. It does feel a little bit like an interview, doesn't it, when it's just the two of us, which is kind of good practice. So
it's weird, but we just power through, I think. I mean, the conversation we were having just before is just as good as this one. So let's relax and keep going.
Yeah, so if you're listening to this conversation, thank you for listening. Hopefully you gain something from it. If you ever want to connect with me after listening to the conversation, either through email or having a conversation of our own, you just let the organizers know and they can connect you with me through my UCalgary email. So if you didn't attend the first session, I'll just tell you a little bit about kind of my work before the PhD and my work in the PhD, just to give context to our posthumanist conversation today. So in my Master's of Arts, I studied what it's like to experience literacy in theatrical spaces, and that research was done using phenomenology and a phenomenologist style lens. And then I moved into posthumanism more so in the doctorate, and so I became really fascinated in the Master's with the nature of experience and the things that impact students' experiences of learning, in my particular context, literacy skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, representing, all those great things. And so in the doctorate, what my work became was more about the ways that process drama, which is a particular type of theater, can be integrated into secondary English language arts classrooms as ways of enhancing literacy and moving learning. And the metaphor I use is from the page to the stage. So kind of getting it up off the page, out of your desk, onto a stage and performing those skills and making meaning in that way. And so posthumanism just lent itself really well to that question. And that question kind of inspired a posthumanist approach. And that's kind of what I think we'll talk about for most of today. So that's a little bit about me as a whirlwind introduction. So ask any questions you wish and we'll start our conversation. So.
Yes, I would like to for you to be a little bit more precise. Oh, somebody's coming in, so we might start over. Hello, Kelly.
Hello.
It's just us. Oh, is she gone?
We scared her away.
Scared her away. We called her by the name, by her name. Never mind. So let's keep going. We can edit this out. So what I would be interested in, and for you to precise, like where, so so what type of students are you talking about? So when you say literacy, you're talking about English, right? English language literacy.
English language arts in the context that I'm collecting data in. So our subject areas are split up into English language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies as the four key and core competencies, the four core subjects. And so I'm focused very much in English language arts. And that can expand to include elements of other languages, but it's primarily an English language course. So
absolutely.
And when I say secondary, just as a clarification in my context, that's grade 7 to grade 12. And the research that I'm doing, particularly right now in the doctorate, is grade 10 and grade 11. So that's considered high school out here in Western Canada, but sometimes grade 9 can also be considered high school, depending on your province. But grade 10 and 11 are high school out here. So.
And then from 11, you can go directly to university, because here we have Cégep. I don't know if you know the system in Quebec. You still go to another, like, pre-university. Would that be it, or?
So they go grade 10, 11, and 12. And then after grade 12, they go straight into university. So there's no grade 13 out here, which is what some other provinces and territories have. But they go straight from grade 12. They can apply in grade 12 to get admitted into university. And then they would start the September following grade 12 if they're accepted.
Okay, so this is your study group. So can you talk a little bit about why, we touched on this subject a little bit last time, but why you turned from a phenomenology into posthumanism, although your area is exactly the same, I mean, but you changed your approach to it. What made you change?
I found personally, and this was just my interpretation of phenomenology, so people are welcome to disagree with it if they wish, but I found phenomenology a teensy bit limiting because of certain things that make up kind of the foundation and the ethos of phenomenology. I got really caught up in the notion of essences and really kind of distilling down to an essence of an experience or an understanding of an experience. And I found it personally a little problematic in my own approach to apply that essence to a whole group of people experiencing something. So there are studies where that's done really well, and there's studies that are really compelling that do that. But for my particular study group in the master's, and even now in the PhD, all of the students are so diverse in their thinking and their experience that it didn't seem genuine to kind of attribute a single essence to all of them. And so what I find posthumanism for me is really good at doing is one, allowing kind of individual experiences to shine through. So allowing each individual student to articulate their own meaning, and from that meaning generate an experience or an understanding of an experience. And I also find posthumanism really beneficial for me in how it brings in considerations of embodiment and relationality between people and their experiences, and really is explicit about that for me. I found that I was kind of pushing boundaries in phenomenology when I tried to do that, and I found I was doing a lot of justification around why I was doing that within a phenomenological lens. And I don't think it certainly wasn't purist phenomenology that I was doing. It was kind of a I know when we were speaking before the recording, I used the word hodgepodge and we laughed about it. But it's kind of a hodgepodge of phenomenology because I used interpretive phenomenological analysis, so IPA. And I kind of use that as a justification for some of the pivoting. But I just find posthumanism a bit more open to those ways of thinking and those conversations and those considerations. And so I've moved into it.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, would you say how different it is embodiment and phenomenology and posthumanism, just if we focus on that point?
Mm. I think you can be more, and this is again my understanding of it, I think you can be more explicit in posthumanism about the embodiment. I think the embodiment can become a unique form of data in posthumanism. And I think it can also add unique layers of understanding to the data. And I think you can be really intentional in posthumanism about asking participants and yourself as the researcher, if you're part of the research process, to really consider notions of embodiment and what embodiment means. Um, I found a lot of the reflections students were doing in the more phenomenological study were still very much grounded outside of the body. So they were doing things like journaling, and those journals took multimodal forms. So there was like pictorial journals, there was written journals, there was audio journals, but that was still very much kind of metacognitive thinking. So thinking about thinking and thinking in your head. Whereas in posthumanism, that thinking can really translate into something more tactile, more lived, more in the quote unquote real world, kind of beyond the thinking about thinking. And so for me, that was a really important shift and really important to like dwell there for a sustained period of time. Because as you know, as a theater practitioner, and as other listeners might know, if they also use theater as a methodology, theater is all about the embodiment and like getting on the stage and rehearsing and doing collaborative creation and workshopping things and really making sure that you're very intentional with your embodiment and very intentional with how you stage a performance or how you stage a particular character, mannerisms, traits, things like that. And those are just really interesting nuances to me as someone who works with theater to really make sure that becomes part of the data and doesn't have to be something that's limited out of the data in any way.
And yes, usually it's the outliers, isn't it? All this experience that we have in the body, but through the body, but in between bodies. And I think it's very what theater is all about. So what about also so going through this embodiment and talking about inter relationality, but also the entanglement, isn't it? I think it's very much the focus of new materialism connected to posthumanism. How do you see this in your research?
I really like the term assemblage and like the coming together of various assemblages. And so I like how that term can be applied to like an individual and the layers that they bring to their own understanding, creating a very personalized assemblage. But then I also like how those can weave together with other people in the same group or in this part of the same study or part of the same learning environment or classroom, and how when they weave together and intertwine, new meaning is made in those in-between spaces. And so the individual will make a very complex, layered, personalized form of meaning, but then that form of meaning is only enriched, expanded, questioned, challenged, changed when it comes into relation with other people's complex layers of meaning. And so what I think phenomenology did for me and how I kind of articulated it and ran it was that there were kind of individual assemblages, but there wasn't really the opportunity for that interweaving between them and that in-between space to really become part of consideration. And so that in-betweenness, that meaning between bodies, between others, between individuals, I find it really fascinating. And I think posthumanism does a really good job of dwelling there and like putting a magnifying glass on that in-between space and allowing us to shine a light in that understanding and to really pull it apart.
Absolutely. It's like, the black matter that is everywhere, but is not seen until we focus on it. And it even seems a little bit like the essence, like, even though we might be looking at the same phenomenon, say, phenomenology is searching for an essence. I think the focus is going like this tangent towards essence. And I think in posthumanism is focusing more on the assemblies and then the being between spaces and entanglements. So I think they're just kind of looking at the same thing, but going different places.
I think one way of looking at it is that phenomenology is very much about the destination, and posthumanism is very much about the journey to that destination.
Amazing.
And so I think it extends out our understanding beyond just what is eventually created or what's there into what actually went into getting there. And I really like the journey in terms of understanding. So
I attended the summer school by Bredotti and in Utrecht University, and there was a literature teacher talking about non-representation, and it was mind-blowing, like how to apply non-representation to words or to literature. And the way she approached it was so interesting because it's, as I said, like we might be looking at the same thing, but the focus is completely different, the way you approach it, and of course experience after this understanding that goes through the material. So what she was saying was that there's this tendency to see the book as something that has its own life and it's happening there, and you have access to the knowledge or to the story once, but the thing is already there. And you just access, or you have to understand the language and understand what's being used, if it's like metaphor or whatever. But her point was that the book doesn't exist in itself. It only exists on the reading of the book. Mm-hmm. So that event then becomes non-representational, mm-hmm. because it's an event of the reading of the book. And of course, everything that takes from there. Mm-hmm. What did you think about it? What you were... in terms of words on the page and the actual reading as the event?
Yeah, there's actually a term in the literacy scholarship called literacy as event. And so where that comes from is originally back in the 1980s, Shirley Bryce Heath published an article around narratives and bedtime stories and like the impact that reading at home has on development of literacy as children grow up. And so she looked at students who had parents who read to them every night versus parents who did not follow that same practice, or parents that had oral storytelling but didn't accompany it with a written text. And she explored the intricacies and the nuances of the differences in that as the children went to school and as they grew up. And that was a primary focus study, so elementary grades. And then more recently in 2020, much more contemporarily, that work has been kind of challenged and expanded upon to include things beyond the text itself. So what Heath did really well, and why that work is still seminal and really important, is that there was a lot of meaning being made in the different modalities of storytelling. And there was a lot of really interesting data she discovered throughout her whole career around how children make meaning and how oral storytelling can be really impactful, and how it's really about engaging with narrative and story and meaning that children are able to grow and build these skills. But how we assess that in school, she pointed out, is not always equal to that. We don't always assess students orally. We often make them read text, we make them write text, very traditional in a lot of ways, especially back then when she collected her data. And she was talking about the disconnect between how children are learning at home versus how we assess them at school, and bridging those together. And so what literacy as event is trying to do more contemporarily is it's trying to look at language learning and literacy as a meaning-making process that includes things beyond text. So as students talk to one another, as they work on group projects, as they design things like plays and shows and productions, as they give presentations and run seminars and simulations, as they talk to one another, as they listen to one another, the benefit of active listening. And so it's just trying to move it again kind of beyond that very harsh binary of like reading and writing into a much more expanded view of literacy. And I think posthumanism can be really helpful in allowing for that expansion to be explored in a way that still connects back to the key competencies we're trying to teach in literacy education. So we can never forget about reading and writing in literacy because they're foundational. And so the risk of going too far away from those concepts is that literacy becomes everything. And if literacy becomes everything, it also becomes nothing. And so there's this really fine line. But posthumanism can be a way of reaching out to that more expanded view while also anchoring it back into an understanding of skills and competencies, I think. And so that's why I'm excited to use it.
And what are you saying? Just it makes so much sense, especially I'm teaching now within the immersive French immersion in a bilingual school. And although, so it's in French, so it's theater in French to stimulate French speaking and then in different aspects, right? Which is very interesting because like I have such a mixed group and some are much more comfortable in speaking French than others. And I thought, since the focus is speaking the language and understanding, it's not about necessarily being on stage speaking the language. I thought if I give them like a very intricate group assignments that they really have to communicate, to be very clear, like they had to do a whole thing that is supposed to be, they're supposed to be watching a sport, and then from their reaction, we should know exactly what kind of sport it is. But the complexity of it, they have to define which sport, what's happening in the game. So is this like a goal? Is this like a strike? And then they have to communicate all that and then have a very specific physical cue so it's so complex. There's so much conversation going there. Although the performance itself had no words, to get there, they had to be communicating in French.
Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to the layers that theater can have in a way that text, independent of any form of art or any form of performance, kind of loses in a bit of its intricacies and complexities. So like when we just have students read a traditional text, it's putting a lot of pressure on the student to read in that language. It's putting a lot of pressure on the student to be able to take that language and interpret it without visual prompting or audio prompting or any form of supplemental understanding. And then we often assess in that same way. So not only do they have to take it in and understand it, they have to be able to regurgitate and communicate in that same modality. Whereas when we allow students the opportunity to, as you say, explore nonverbal performances or explore cues in different ways or understanding in different ways, it welcomes them into the process of learning to understand in that language in a much more approachable way that gives them avenues of understanding that aren't necessarily all grounded in just the language itself. And so the language is there. The language is being learned as they do this process, but it's not so in your face all the time. And it's not so limited that the student gets anxiety or kind of becomes very anxious or nervous as they go through the process. Because I find when I teach literacy courses at the post-secondary level, I always ask the students who will become teachers, they're pre-service teachers, what are your feelings about literacy? And there's always a good handful, sometimes 25%, sometimes almost half the class, that says they had negative experiences with literacy as a learner. And when I ask about where those negative experiences come from, it's often from things like that, like very traditional reading assignments, having to read out loud, being shamed for the ability to read or inability to read or write. And they have very emotional ties to literacy, and sometimes in a negative sense because of what happened to them in their learning. And so I think theater can be a really innovative, fun way of breaking down those experiences and bringing in some positivity into those experiences as well and allowing them to engage with the learning differently. So.
Absolutely. And I was just going through this exact question, and because I'm working as an assistant director to opera, I just mentioned to you, and then I couldn't follow, although I cannot read music, like in opera, you have actually the lyrics are there, what they call the libretto, everything is there. And it's like, why everybody's reading and I cannot read? And I just realized that I need glasses for that specific distance. So I have this for reading, and I don't need glasses for. So then so I had just to order some new glasses, and I was thinking back of all the ways I avoided writing on the board or reading a text, and then I thought like maybe it was just because I need glasses and I couldn't read because of the specific, and then it in a way it gave me so much trauma because I felt unable when I was like mumbling my words. And then I developed a whole memorization of movement and things to compensate. So it's interesting how you're learning with this kind of difficulties or trauma can develop other skills, but also can maybe be fixed with just new glasses. And I'm 51. It's amazing that now I realize I need these other glasses. So if we go back, so this is one thing, like using the language as communication, not necessarily as a form of expression, that we were saying that in theater, we talk about the embodiment, we talked about that in-betweenness and all these that has been overlooked because also we have to follow a criteria, isn't it? When we are assessing, there's this criteria, and the criteria is just stressing what the values of that type of education is. So can you talk us a little bit about the case study and how posthumanist case study methodology comes into your research?
Yeah, so I use case study methodology as the principal methodology, but it is informed by posthumanist tendencies is the language I use. And what that means is in a traditional case study, there's very set boundaries. So you bound it to a particular class, or you bound it to a particular population of participants, or you bound it to a very particular metrics in some way. Posthumanism can be really useful in blurring those boundaries. So it doesn't mean you fully remove the boundary. You might still work with a very particular grade level, like grade 10 or grade 11, as I mentioned, but you can allow different understandings to come into relation with one another across those grades or across different people in the study and different participants. I've also articulated it in my work. I'm just looking at some notes here around allowing me to look at different factors. So I've mentioned the bounding and the context, and also allowing for moments of emergence, as I term it, to occur within the assemblage that we mentioned. And so as they're coming together in embodiment and relationality, the blurring of those boundaries allows the emergence to come forward. And the emergence is really powerful, especially when we get into considerations of like non-human agents or more than human entities. We talked about it a little bit in our conversation already, but haven't really dwelled there yet. And so things like the stage itself and how the stage would impact the performance, or things like the classroom environment and how literacy rich is that classroom environment. What language is available for students to call upon? Is their language displayed? If they're multilingual, is their home language at all available in the classroom, or is it entirely English-based? What are the implications of that in the learning? And so the posthumanism and this idea of emergence within all these factors can allow those things to come into play, but importantly, it allows the participant or the student to bring them into play. And so it's not me as the researcher pulling things and trying to make threads, but it allows the students to articulate to me, perhaps if they don't see their L1 or their first language, they can bring that into consideration. They may not feel as included in the learning, or they may feel like there's less supports if there isn't like multilingual or bilingual options when they're learning new and difficult concepts, as an example. And so posthumanism can allow them to bring that forward and bring that into dialogue with participants and teachers that I work with, and with myself as a researcher.
So it's all these assemblages within assemblages. And I wonder if, because of course, when you are performing, then there's another assemblage that happens. So do you go in any ways near this in a case of, open classroom or performance or sharing something? Does it?
So the way that I collect data is kind of in a series of different stages. So I will have kind of informal dialogues or conversations with students and teachers. So they're similar to semi-structured interviews, but they're a little bit more free-flowing. Because in my master's, I found that some students got intimidated by the very traditional semi-structured interview. If we were in a conference room and I was sitting across the table from them and we were having a one-on-one conversation, those were great conversations in the master's, but they're also intimidating for students if they don't know you very well, or just as an adult that they're speaking to. It can sometimes change what they give you. Some students, even in my master's, articulated that they were trying to answer initially what they thought I wanted to hear. And then as they got more comfortable in the conversation, they became a bit more honest. And so the informal conversations allow for a bit more of that honesty to come forward right away and a bit more comfort level for the participants. I also collect artifacts that the students produce. So that can be anything that they produce in relation to English language arts as the discipline, or anything that uses language in particular ways. Doesn't have to be written language. It could be an audio file, it could be visual, it could be written, but anything that they articulate as of related to literacy. And then I also have them create performances and do performative work in the class as well. But that performative work comes closer to the end of the cycle. So we do the conversational data collection and building of trust and things like that first. And then we also do some artifact collection that they're already working on in class before performances. And then we'll use that information from the conversations and the artifacts to inform performances and further build upon ideas or further explore different concepts or questions. And then hopefully those performances add a new understanding for the learner and for the class. And it's all in service of the outcomes. It's all in service of the curriculum. It's all in service of what the teacher's already doing in the class. So it's not extra work for the class either, which was really important to me. It's all meant to be supportive pedagogy for what's already occurring organically in the class and better understanding it through different approaches and perspectives.
So when it gets to the end, so the actual sharing is with an outside audience, is not part of your research.
I always do it with an invited audience. And so it's an invited audience by the participants and the class. So they can decide how public it becomes. I think that's really important in this type of research, just to allow for their comfort to be the top priority and them to be able to set the boundary, both ethically and just kind of in general. In the past, when I did research in my master's, they invited other students in the school, other teachers in the school, their parents and kind of community members, and then an examination committee from the university as part of like my formal evaluation. So it was public to the school community, but not public to the wider kind of city community or wider Calgary community, and I'm fine with that. I haven't gotten to that stage in the doctoral research yet, but I would anticipate, based on my understanding of the context I'm collecting data, it would be something similar. So public within the school, but not public within the wider city. So.
And will this go into as data for yourself as well, as like the thing itself, or a self-reflexivity of the event from the student's point of view? How would you approach that?
So I record and transcribe conversations as a form of data. I take visual records of artifacts, so either screenshots or screen captures of visuals or documentation around written work. And then for the performance pieces, I do a captured series of still images, and then I associate those with researcher memos. So I'll capture a still image from a performance. I will blur faces and anonymize the image, and then I will associate a researcher memo or researcher notes with that image. And the blurring and anonymization of the images to protect the student's identity and to align with ethical standards set out in my ethics application and things like that. But I don't capture video. I do for my own kind of reflection when I'm doing the memo writing, but that video is not captured in the actual dissertation. So I don't hyperlink the video within the dissertation or within the publications that arise from the dissertation. But I will include anonymized versions of still images in the dissertation and in resulting work from it.
So if maybe I'm totally mistaken, but so it seems like this course like serves your research more than having like this course on the school and then parents' expectations and school expectations. Can you clarify it for me? Is how this work?
Can you clarify what? I'm sorry.
No, first, like coming from a drama teacher working in schools, so drama is there for some purpose, could be for arts, for performing arts, or, you know, or could be like mine linked to French speaking, immersive. So there is a reason for it to be there, and there is an expected outcome from the students sometimes, but I mean, mainly parents and school, the school itself, of this outcome that needs to be shared with a community. So having this is my mindset. What are you saying? So like, how does it work within the institution, your research, the students' application, and then the expectation from the community?
So because it's situated in English language arts, the expectation or the outcomes for the learning for the students come from the English language arts curriculum. So those are taken from the curricular documents and the expectations within that particular discipline. And then some outcomes from the dramatic arts program of studies can be brought in as kind of interdisciplinary or cross-curricular outcomes and understandings, but that's entirely up to the individual teacher. Everything process drama oriented and data collection oriented for my research aligns with expectations for English language arts primarily. So it's possible for me to go into that setting and allow and support the teachers in meeting those outcomes that they're already striving towards without seeming like an interruption or any extra curricular burden. Part of what I hope comes out of the research, but I can't say yet until all the data is collected, is I hope that it shows that there's places for the dramatic arts curriculum in other disciplines. Because at least in my context from where I've personally taught, drama is seen as something very separate from other subject areas. And it's often not given the same resources as other subject areas. So you often teach drama in like the school foyer, or in like a hallway, or in a very traditional classroom without any access to stages or equipment or lighting or any of the technical theater components you'd typically want to have in your ideal theater space. And so I'm just looking for ways within my research to allow it to exist in different ways and different capacities in other subject areas to allow it to become a more integrated part of existing curriculum. But the parental expectations, the student expectations, the teacher's expectations, they're all aligned with English language arts. And they meet those outcomes, and those outcomes will be reported through assessments that the teacher will do alongside the research, but those assessments are not part of the research process. So I'm not assessing students and not assigning grades to students as I generate data with them and work with them. I'm merely there to kind of assist them through what they are being assessed on by giving them this different way of engaging with the content or different way of thinking about the content. But as part of my ethical considerations and part of my own stance as a teacher, I didn't want to be assigning a grade or a numeric value to the work that they're doing, because I wanted the motivation and hopefully the desire to keep up with the approaches to come more so from an interest and a genuine learning space as opposed to an assessment-oriented outcome.
So within your group, would you have those that, like, for instance, have chosen not to participate, or was it like more of a, this is for this purpose?
So in the wider class, because class sizes out here are pretty big, they're anywhere from like 35 to 40 students. And in a typical group of 35 to 40, I'll have up to about 12 at the most participating formally in the research. And by formally, I mean like collecting data from those students. They've gone through all the consent forms and consent processes. They have parental consent, data is anonymized from them, all of that, et cetera, et cetera. But anyone who's not formally in the research process, meaning I'm not collecting data from them, they still get to participate in the process drama-based activities, and they can still have conversations with me, and I can still support them through the work that they're doing as a trained English language arts teacher. I'm just not collecting data from them, and I can't write and won't write about things in the classroom that I observe that include them in those observations. So they get kind of limited out of observations for their own privacy because they're not part of the formal process, but they can still benefit in the moment itself when that work is happening in class. So.
And I would like to talk a little bit more about, you talk about journaling or memos, or, you know, how do you think it changed for you, and then maybe consequently to also your students, of like self-reflection when you are under like a more phenomenological approach and now with a more post-human approach?
In the phenomenological understanding, I interpreted that methodology as being very much about their experience. So my reflection was less self-reflection and more reflection on what they were doing. But now in the post-humanist approach, I definitely see myself as the researcher as part of that process. Whether or not I'm a part of the actual data directly that I'm collecting, I'm still indirectly a part of that data as being the person asking for it to be created, the person who's collecting it. The lens through which I look at it through might be different than the lens of the student. The fact that I'm even in the room itself changes the learning environment because I'm a new adult, a researcher, a very particular lens. And so I take that as much more of an opportunity to self-reflect and self-position myself in the actual classroom, which I think is a positive change from the way that I engaged with phenomenology, being much more aware of just how the presence of a researcher and the researcher themselves can alter or influence data, even unintentionally, just through the nature of being there. So I do a lot more self-reflection in the post-humanist space than I did in the phenomenological one. So.
Although you might call it this, it's so going. Oh, I had so many thoughts at one point. Now let me. Of course, like I was thinking of Karen Barrett, and then the quantum physics association with that. That is, you are in the room, you're immediately part of it. Should have written that down. Yes. So I was thinking at my own research. So my idea of approaching through through theater pedagogy is positionality, identity, and beyond. So the idea behind why theater pedagogy as a preparation for in-service and pre-service teachers to EDI work. And my point is, and then this is what Braidotti articulates very clearly with politics of location, so positionality from the feminist point of view, is that we are our own blind spot. So it doesn't matter how much self-reflection we do, there's still that part we cannot assess, which is where we are, isn't it? So the need for a group, the need for that outside feedback of what we are doing, for me, it's crucial to coming into EDI with a different perspective. So what I'm trying to say is that theater brings in, as we talked about, the embodiment and the entanglement, but still for biases, they're very much unconscious or unknown. When you try to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom from the point of view of the teacher, trying to face, it's like there's no amount of self-reflexivity that can grant you those blind spots, those biases of things or encounters you haven't had, so you don't know. How does it sound for you that although with this methodology, the posthumanism, and then understanding the entanglement, that point of the blind spot, how do you see it happening in your research, if that concept makes sense to you?
One way I'm trying to be cognizant of it in the doctoral work as opposed to the master's work is in the master's, I worked primarily with students and I didn't work as directly with teachers in the master's. The students kind of worked with me. We had a supplemental project that was going kind of alongside what the teacher was doing in their ELA class. In the doctorate, it's much different, whereas it's happening all live in the ELA class, supporting that class, working very directly with the teacher or teachers of multiple classes. And they're very much a part of the process. And so I really value the teacher in that context in my research as being able to point out elements of the blind spot, as you call it, that are unknown to me. And so the teacher will have a very good, very developed understanding of their particular class, especially by the time that I see them, because it's usually later in the semester that I come in and see them. So the teacher will have a well-established pre-existing relationship with the class and a good understanding. And then the teacher also has all of their years of experience, their pedagogies, their approaches. Very typically, teachers I work with have been teaching English language arts for many years, and so they're very well positioned and well established in the discipline. So they have an understanding of the discipline and of their students beyond what I would have independent of them. And so I really rely on conversations with the teacher and working with the teacher when planning lessons or planning the dramatic processes we use in relation to the outcomes, or even understanding of students' artifacts, because the teacher will have more contextual knowledge of the student that will lead to a better understanding of those artifacts beyond what I would have alone. So I've really come to value, and I always have valued teachers as professionals, as I was one, but I've come to really value them in research as well as a key collaborator, a key ally in that process of coming to better understand the contextual relationship of their class, but also the contextual understanding of the wider space that that class articulates within a school. I hope that makes sense. I think that
Totally. So, so then going back to the teacher, so this other teacher, so you're the researcher, they are the teacher in the classroom, they're previous, so they are able to shed light, so to say, in those blind spots, yours and the students and the in-betweenness and maybe like past or background. And what about you seeing their blind spots? How does it work the other way around?
I don't do it as explicitly the other way around because I don't have as much understanding of the context in reverse. So because I come into the classroom so late in the semester, and not so late, about halfway through the semester, but still a pretty substantial amount of time has passed before I get there. I don't want to seem like I'm overreaching, if that makes sense. So the teacher is being very generous in inviting me into the classroom environment. The teacher and the school itself is also being very generous in inviting me in. And so I don't see it as kind of a critique. And I know that's not necessarily what pointing out blind spots or biases needs to be. But I tread carefully in that type of space. I'll offer my own perspective, and I will certainly ask questions in response to things that the teacher offers as forms of illumination or forms of additional understanding. But those questions are more so to articulate the understanding a bit more concretely, as opposed to kind of offering a complete counter viewpoint of what's going on. So I really value the teacher as a trusted collaborator, and part of that kind of trusting process is kind of, I know we all possess our own individual biases and our own individual lenses and perspectives, but I try really hard to value that perspective quite deeply, just due to the nature of the data collection and the nature of the dialogues we have to have a really constructive, positive environment. One of the things I hope teachers take away from the research at the teacher level is I hope that they take away some of the pedagogical approaches. I hope they take away some of the drama games or exercises. I hope they take away a better understanding in general of the fine and performing arts. I don't know what it's like out in Quebec, but out in Alberta, there's not a ton of professional development for arts-based research and teaching. So I really just hope to be another connection point for teachers, to have someone to reach out to if they have additional questions, or to take away some things they'd hopefully use in their practice once I'm long gone from that particular classroom. But yeah, I
like this advocate for drama, pedagogies in multiple situations. It's just like, for instance, when I came into this school, it's a public school, bilingual, but mainly English. But is that when they came we went to the classroom, so they have like different spaces. It's like the total impossibility to listen. Impossible to make yourself to be listened to as a teacher if you don't shout or scream. So I could diagnose in a way, just by being in the classroom and being given no ears to what I was saying if I didn't like raise my voice. So we are now in the 6th week, and I'm getting there. So it's just the need for listening, for theater, and then it's like I cannot do anything else until they're able to listen. There's nothing that can be done in theater if they don't listen. It's just like a first, So in this case, of course, it's very different. I'm not doing your research. I'm invited there to immerse the students into doing theater in another language, But I find that when we come into there's a culture, and that I think theater is such a good way to diagnose, because it's about dynamics, power dynamics, relationality, and the use of space and the betweenness, isn't it? That and then thinking at posthumanism, and thinking of the because I just wrote an article on Jacques Lecoq, and then he's very much from the 50s, and then his whole vocabulary is pretty much humanist, right? But I think his pedagogy is so advanced and so post-humanist and new materialist that is this thing, like for instance, he talks about fond poétique commun. He talks about like this universal background, like poetic background that we all share as humans. You know, the falling trees, I don't know, the water. There's always something that we can all relate, but we all have our unique experience with that memory or physical experience. So I find sometimes that we might be able to reach out other art, as you said, like Heath in the 80s were already thinking of that. And then we have to, for us, researching in the 2020s is maybe go and see this and think, yes, there's something there that might be needed little translation or a little upgrade, so people are not taken aback by the wording, because it's so automatically associated with some kind of theoretical thread or stem, that I think there's so much that there are pedagogues that were post-humanist before posthumanism, and we cannot detect unless because of the language. Did you come across something like that you needed, like there's something there that, like, as you said, like you take from a different post-humanist, but I think also like Lecoq is, if you think, is very much of a, sometimes Sartre, sometimes Camus, you know, his language is very poetic and he goes a little bit in his poetry, but the way he's teaching is very much open-ended, relational, and yeah, post-humanist, I would say, in some aspects.
Yeah, I think part of the shift from phenomenology to posthumanism was kind of that understanding of pedagogy versus like theory. Because in the phenomenology, pardon me, it was very human centric. Like it was very much focused on their experiences, and it didn't necessarily consider their experiences in conjunction with more than human agents. It was what they articulated as their experience, their takeaway, their performance. And performance is a very constructed thing many times, especially when you script it and rehearse it as we did. And so it was very kind of human centric. The post-human approach is more about like I said earlier, the process of getting there. And so that process is often the pedagogy of getting there, the way of teaching that concept, the way of engaging with it. And so I can definitely agree or relate to someone whose pedagogy is very post-humanist, but whose theoretical foundation, at least for a very long time, was very human-centric. And I think in faculties of education and schools of education, we tend to be very human-centric because we're focused on the learner and how the learner learns and how our teaching impacts that process. And so it's very much grounded in hopefully the individual students, but also sometimes large groups of students if we're differentiating, or grade levels if we're moving between particular teaching assignments. We change our pedagogy to align with different expectations and different curriculum, but we tend to be very human oriented in the profession, which is a good thing in many ways. But the post-human approach does allow for that consideration of in addition to that, things like the school itself, the learning environment. And we do talk about that in faculties of education as well. How do you set up your classroom? What does a rich learning environment look like? What does it include? And things like that. But I think post-humanism allows not only the setup of the space to be that consideration, but also what happens in that space to continue to keep those considerations active and alive and very much at the forefront of thought and teaching. So.
But so you think, like for academia, with your supervisor, and how do you think this will land as data? And I would say post-human methodology is quite new. And then I've been told that, one cannot get any funding if you mention it. So how is it for you with your supervisor or your committee to commit to this methodology, and then how do you think this will impact your PhD process as a candidate?
Well, I can't speak to other people's experiences. I've been incredibly well funded, so I've been very blessed with funding and opportunities as a result of the post-human approach that I take. It's inspired a lot of my course design, and I've been very fortunate in being able to offer quite a bit of teaching while being a PhD student and candidate. I'm on my 31st post-secondary course for teaching, so I've had a lot of opportunities to kind of hone the practice and think about it very deeply and change up course design, structure, assignments, readings, all based around this post-human understanding. For the research itself, though, I really hope the data lands as a story. I hope that it's narrative. I hope that it reads as very much an invitation to something more than what it is by itself. I kind of want to open the space and open the curtain a bit, especially in secondary school, around literacy and drama. So a lot of the research, at least in my context here in Alberta, around drama-based approaches to literacy, it's very primary oriented. It's very much K to 6, so kindergarten to
Role play, etc.
Yeah, creative play, structured play, unstructured play, the Montessori methods that happen in primary. And in secondary, there's a lot of assumptions about literacy that are made. We kind of assume students are good readers. We assume students are gifted writers. We assume that they're comfortable with these different skills and competencies. And then we try and dig deeper in secondary and get more metaphorical, more symbolic. We get more complicated as they move up the grade levels. But I really kind of want to open the curtain that not everyone has that comfort level, for one, but for the students who don't, drama and the fine arts can really be a way of building that comfort and getting them more prepared to do that more traditional work after the fact or in conjunction with more traditional work. And so I wrote my master's thesis very much in a narrative style. I've had it compared to a hero's journey style of writing, so that very traditional narrative flow of event after event. And I would hope to kind of continue that in the doctoral dissertation. One thing my supervisor and I are toying with as a way of writing the dissertation, at least chapter 4, which is the findings chapter, and chapter 5, which is the implications, is we're toying with the idea of doing scripting as part of the process of writing. And so having more traditional chapter sections, but supplemented and woven through with more dialogic scripting elements that can be perhaps samples of researcher memos that were written during the process, or expansions upon those memos, or different ways of reflecting on different data that's being presented. And so I really hope to kind of push that boundary. If I had unlimited time and I didn't feel as pressured to finish as I do, and that's no one's fault, that's entirely me wanting to finish. I'd love to do something more video based, or more. I had a colleague defend a dissertation that was written like a graphic novel, which I thought was fascinating, and I'm I wish I was that creative. And so it was wonderful, it was outstanding. So that could be a way of doing it when I have more time to do similar research in the future. But that's kind of how I'm going to lightly push in that direction as finishing this particular PhD process. And then I really want to keep expanding upon those ways of thinking as I move, hopefully, onward into academia after the process finishes. So.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm really looking forward to it. And to say it makes perfect sense to have that, dialogical form for theater, for literacy, for learning and discussing data. For me, I did my literature review all as a play, so I totally see the point of doing that.
Which is magical that you did that. That's wonderful.
I have to say, to the last version, it has improved. So it's almost 2:00. Guess what? We've done it.
Well, thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen, and I hope that you hopefully got something out of it, or at least enjoyed the conversation. Like I said, if the organizers for this event want to connect anyone with me, you're very welcome to. You have my contact information. I don't mind if you send it out to anyone who's interested. And if not, I hope to join more of your events in the future and keep conversations going. So.
Thank you so much. Yes, I will propose some other conversations. It was very, very enriching for all of us. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to record this, and yes, it's going to become a podcast.